hard to know how to handle and navigate difficult situations in our life, especially difficult conversations that we need to have with people, right? Maybe it's someone that we really love and care about, and we see them going down the wrong path. They're making destructive decisions, right? They could be walking away from God, and you feel this tension between wanting and feeling like you need to speak up, right? But also you want to stay quiet and comfortable. Have you ever been in that situation?
Oh, definitely. Yes, I can relate. And Jenna, it reminds me of, well, just imagine that you're driving your car, you're on mountain roads, and they're curvy, they're steep, and you can be driving like 60, and then you start noticing that the speed limit signs are decreasing. 60 to 50 to 40, it's down to 25. Well, you're going into a blind curve and you're thinking, what on earth? And so as you take that curve and come around, you see ahead of you, it says dead end. So there's a logical reason why there were warnings. And you turn around. As you're turning around, you realize there's a car speeding, not lessening their speed. They're continuing to come at a high rate. And out of ethical behavior, humanity, you don't want this person to get killed going through the dead end sign and over a cliff. So you start blinking your lights and even honking your horn with blinking, because you're trying to help rescue this motorist who seems not aware or ignoring what could become a deadly decision, a lack of making that tough decision. Just lower your speed. So I think in a way that can help us with just even approaching the idea of difficult conversations. If this loved one's continuing to make these self-destructive, negative decisions in life, we want them to know that it's dangerous, and we love them. We don't want them to go over that cliff.
Absolutely. So, yeah, that's really good. Establishing the importance of having the conversation. Like, we as Christians, we have like this moral obligation to kind of help course correct these people that are in our lives. Right? So, all right, we've established the importance of it, but all right, we're having this conversation. How do we do it? Right? Now, it's important to go at it in a certain way, because if you lean too far one way, you risk hurting the person, right? Hurting their feelings and destroying the relationship, right? But if you lean too far the other way, you risk compromising truth. And I've always thought that Jesus does a great way of kind of bridging that gap, right? Showing that it's not an either or. Because in John chapter 1, verse 14, John writes and says that Jesus came in the fullness of grace and truth. Not half grace, not half truth, not sometimes grace and sometimes truth, but full of both simultaneously at all times. Now this means that grace and truth, unlike what people believe, they're not in competition with each other, right? But they can actually work beautifully together, just as Jesus shows us. Because if we only have truth without grace, we risk hurting people, right? But if we have grace without truth, we can just affirm we're dishonest, right? We're affirming the behavior that we don't agree with, and that Jesus shows us a better way, and that's not it. But because Jesus reflects both, it's so beautiful, because he never lowers the standard, but he also never lowers his compassion and grace and love that he has for other people.
Jenna, it dawned on me that we could turn to the Gospel of John, the 8th chapter, and that to me seems like one of the best examples of grace and truth existing in a tough conversation, in a tough situation. In the Gospel of John, the 8th chapter, this is when the scribes and Pharisees are trying to trick Jesus, trap him, and show he's not the Messiah. He needs to follow all of God's laws, and he can't be. So we need to trick him, catch him. But that just doesn't happen, because what they do is they actually arrest a woman. They drag her to Jesus. She has been caught in the sin of adultery, and these scribes and Pharisees almost push her onto Jesus into a circle where they've surrounded the woman and Jesus. And the first thing that the scribes and Pharisees say is, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery." Now, in the law of Moses, we're commanded to stone such a person, such a sinner. What do you say about her? Well, they said this not to be guardians of Mosaic law, but they said this in order to present Jesus with a tough situation and a tough conversation. They wanted to test him and prove him wrong. But Jesus bent down and he started drawing something on the ground. We don't know what he wrote on the ground. But then they just continued to ask him, what do you say we should do about this woman, this sinner? And Jesus just said, he said, the first person who has committed no sin gets to throw the first stone. That's the way it should be. The first sinless person in this circle needs to throw the first stone. And he lets that sink in, and he stoops back down and he starts writing some more on the ground. And one by one, quietly,
start dropping like flies.
Oh, they do. And it starts with the oldest Pharisee in the group, who's doing some self-reflection now and knows he's not sinless, that no one is. And he quietly leaves, and then the next person, and it ends up being there is no Pharisee left in that circle. It's the sinful woman and Jesus. And Jesus looks up and he says, "Woman, is there no one here to condemn you?"
Where'd they all go?
What was that?
Where'd they all go?
Where'd they all go? Those sinless men, those sinless Pharisees. And she says, "Well, no one, Lord. No one's left." And then Jesus says this wonderful example of grace and truth. He says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and do not sin again."
Well, that's a wonderful example. That fits perfectly with grace and truth. And what I love about that story is that Jesus doesn't ignore her sin, but he also doesn't call her by it, define her by it.
Yes.
Right? And one of my favorite sayings is that the devil knows your name, but he calls you by your sin. But Jesus, he knows your sin, but he calls you by your name. And that really shows the forgiveness that Jesus offers both the woman and us, and that it's possible to reflect that balance in our lives of both grace and truth in the conversations that we have. So Janie, what does this look like for us?
To start with, before we contact that loved one, friend, family member, we need to do James 1:5, because we need all the wisdom we can get that starts with God.
That's right.
Heavenly Father, please, first of all, give me the motive. Why is it I want to have this difficult conversation with this friend or this family member? So what's my motive? And then it's, Heavenly Father, give me the words that I can speak truth in a gracious way. So I start with James 1:5. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask it of God, who gives liberally, abundantly, and does not upbraid us, does not criticize us for a lack of wisdom, but instead offers us the words to say. And then one of the toughest Bible verses, I think, to live, probably next to loving our enemies, is it comes from Ephesians, and it's chapter 4, and it's verse 15. And in verse 15, Paul wrote this: rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who's the head, unto Christ. So speaking the truth in love, and what you've said, explaining this so beautifully, was that we often think we have to choose between truth and grace. And we don't when we follow Jesus' example.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people, I feel like they focus so much on the content of what they're saying rather than the contact that they might be making. They might be making ripples or they might be making waves, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
And the content is truth. And all that Jesus says and does, it's always truth. But the contact that he's making is graceful, right? He's always leading with compassion, leading with love, leading with mercy. And then, like you said, the motive. I love that. The motive isn't to, come out of this conversation making sure that the other person knows that I'm right and they're wrong, right? The goal is that you have a relationship after this conversation as well, right? Not just before, but you come out of the conversation also having a relationship, and actually one that is strengthened, one that is deepened because you've had this relationship. And to let them know that you are going to walk alongside them through this, that you're not just there to point out their flaws, but you're there to encourage them and to help them as a fellow believer, fellow child of God. And we were all made in God's image, so I think also having that perspective, right, that of seeing people the way that God sees them, not just to see them as for their mistakes, right? So I think that's so beautiful, because the goal is always to point others to Jesus Christ, but also to resemble him in the process.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jenna.